thank you all for joining us. My name is Robbie Nock, and I'm the Director of Entrepreneurship and Professional Practice here at ArtCenter College of Design. And this is our fourth day in Creative Tech Week at the college and the fourth session of the day. So thank you for staying with us. And our conversation this afternoon, evening, middle of the night, wherever you are, is going to look at how our community is crafting emergent technology, and particularly what are some of the questions and practices that really address responsible practice. So thinking about implications, thinking about long-term outcomes, thinking about ways in which products, users, businesses, and technology are formed by technology, by creative practice, and really influenced by that in ways that might not always seem obvious at the surface. And to really start things off here, I'd like to share that Kevin, JD, and Azeez have been huge contributors to ArtCenter before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and through a current moment. They have built a collaboratively with us and as leaders on their own right, a platform called Critical Discourse and Design, which really aims to cross-pollinate ArtCenter with the greater design and education and technology communities through critical discourse on ways to divest design from inequitable systems and foster the conditions for equitable learning and practice, to really radically expand the references and histories and places where design can be developed and learned and kind of brought together. So part of that conversation has really sort of established what we're going to talk about today, which is the need for designers to be more strategic, manage even more complexity, and often lead teams in areas that are beyond what they might have been expecting in their education or what they might have been trained in thinking about their design discipline. And that new complexity, that new reality in which designers are working requires a really broad set of skills and approaches and questions and practices that are all will benefit from developing. So that's going to be the conversation. And before we really get into the dialogue, it's important for you to hear from our speakers themselves on their backgrounds, where they are today, and what their work is outside of ArtCenter. So with that, I'd love to start with you, JD. JD is a faculty member and a great friend, and has a huge, just a huge array of experiences for this.
Hi, Robbie. Always good to see you. So I'm JD Buckley. Currently, I lead the service design team at a mid-stage startup called Service Titan here in Glendale, California. And Service Titan specializes in software for field workers. I'm also, as Robbie pointed out, an adjunct assistant professor at ArtCenter, and I've worked in tech for about 22 years. I've worked at companies, incubators like Ideal Lab and Yahoo, DirecTV, consulted with Kaiser. I've worked at ADP, done some work with Disney, Edmunds.com, and even disruptive companies like Daiquiri that specializes in augmented reality. So I've done stuff.
And maybe Azeez, do you want to follow?
Yeah, sure. It's a tough to follow JD with all of her experience and wealth of knowledge and wisdom. But yeah, my name is Azeez Ali. I am a product designer at Netflix. I also co-founded a company, a nonprofit called Design to Divest, which focuses a lot on divesting the design industry from a lot of the inequitable practices that it has, and really uplifting Afrocentric and indigenous practices as it relates to design thinking. And in some ways a lot ties into the work that I do at Netflix, because I am a product designer for globalization. And so when we are able to watch a movie or show that was made in Korea or Spain, and it be localized and have subtitles and dubbing that is in Sweden and multiple different languages, I work on those tools in order to enable that to happen. And so, yeah, that is kind of what I do at Netflix, and yeah.
All right, well, I guess I can pick up from here. It's you know, even tougher now following these two amazing folks here. So I'm Kevin Simmons. I'm a service designer at Volvo Group, and that's working the commercial transportation logistics industry. Previously, I worked in the human resources industry as a user experience researcher at SAP SuccessFactors. And I'm also a product design alumni from ArtCenter with a background in environmental design and systems-oriented design.
Great, thank you, Kevin, Azeez, and JD. And to start things off, Azeez, maybe you could share with us a little bit about how technology, and particularly creative technology, is infused within your work at Netflix. Where does it live? What does it look like? And how do you intersect with that as a product designer for globalization?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when we look at like Netflix and we look at kind of the entertainment industry, Netflix has been one of the pioneers and kind of, I wouldn't say in disrupting, but also evolving the entertainment industry. And just like, there's so many different ways that we can kind of imagine technology as an inspiring tool in order to better the way that we experience the world or experience the things that we are engaging in. And I think that that's one thing that's very core to Netflix and the way that Netflix operates, of constantly trying to improve, but utilizing technology in a way to augment our experiences, augment our entertainment experience. So in one case, we're looking at just the amount of work that it takes to build a streaming platform that works across multiple different devices in a consistent basis. Also the personalization, you know, recommending people titles. There's a lot of technology and a lot of things that go on behind the scenes in order to try to deliver recommendations to people that are going to resonate with their taste. And that's very, 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 very difficult. But in addition, when we look at the entertainment industry in general, it's been a very insular industry. Everything's kind of built off of relationships. And it's very difficult there's a lot of bottlenecks that can happen in terms of like getting work done. At Netflix, like, we've used technology to figure out, you know, how can we streamline the processes and reduce cost and reduce overhead so we can give more money to content creators globally, more money to content creators in Africa and South America and in Asia. And this is actually a huge reason why Netflix has been so successful, is the utilization of technology and looking at from pitch all the way to post-production, right? What are the different ways in which we can start to innovate on this process that's been pretty much the same for hundreds of years in terms of getting a movie, script written, budget planning, and then all the way to post-production, marketing, and localization. And so, you know, in general, you know, lots of the work and the ways that we kind of view technology is how do we start to use technology to augment all of the experiences that our members are having, but not only our members, but the creators. You know, how do we allow them to be focused much more on the creativity as opposed to some of the minute details that can be very tedious and pull away from the creative thought and creative thinking that of creating their content.
I think that's so interesting. And a lot of times when we talk about creative technology, people often think about an end product. They think about, a gaming device or a wearable or a virtual reality headset. But what your work addresses is something that's actually deeper within the underlying system, that it's about connecting technology to the underlying creative community that's building and making and telling stories. JD, I know you've experienced a lot of these different types of ways in which technology and creativity come together. How have you moved from an organization like DAQRI, which is producing hardware, into and where you are now in the work you do in enterprise design for Service Titan? What's sort of those connection points between maybe a kind of a product version of creative technology to a process version of creative technology?
Well, I think the cool thing about the design process is, whether it's new technology or something you're more familiar with, the process is the same, which starts with the human. It starts with us understanding what we think the current set of problems are, being sure that we talk to the real humans, being sure there is a diverse array of humans that we talk to, so it's representative of an entire population, being sure that we infuse that information and have, I think I'm always famous for saying to people that, and I think I'm probably sure I stole it from somebody else, but good design is a series of informed trade-offs. So the more information that we take in to drive our decisions, the better trade-offs that we can make. It really is an exercise in critical thinking. Good design is an exercise in critical thinking. And one of the things that I think people kind of forget about technology is that, particularly when we're thinking about things that are not seen, that kind of is happening in the back end behind, assisted driving vehicles or self-driving cars or AI, is that is designed too. The research experiment that drives and informs and trains those algorithms has to be designed. And so the research, being sure that we understand and gather data and perspectives from a broad population or a diverse population to train and create the rules that drive that algorithm, also have to be considered. So I think one of the things that's interesting about the way technology is evolving these days is as much work will be done in terms of not seeing the creativity. It's not always the hardware or the software. A lot more, particularly as we evolve, is going to be happening in anticipating our behavior. And that is design too. And so one of the things that we consider, and particularly when I'm at Service Titan, where we're thinking about field workers who are historically not tech savvy, technology is evolving where it's being more accessible for farm workers, for what were considered jobs that oftentimes were paper and pencil. Now we're seeing technology available for everything from the auto shop to the farm worker to warehouses. All of those have a degree which they are anticipating human behavior. One of the things that's really interesting about being a researcher is trying to check your own bias. And there is what's called the implicit bias test. So as a researcher, research will say that 70 to 75% of us have an implicit bias. We're all biased in some way. It's completely human. But checking yourself, particularly as a researcher who is designing or going to be involved in designing an algorithm, you can take a test to check yourself. And it's the implicit bias test at the Kirwan Institute of Ohio State. You can take the test. You don't have to, Instagram it, or you can definitely keep it to yourself. But being aware is the first step, particularly as a researcher, in being sure that you check yourself and incorporate that information, or be sure that you're gathering more diverse information and making additional trade-offs, and not thinking from just your own perspective as we develop these unseen algorithms that are driving our behavior and driving the software and providing opportunities for different people who haven't generally had access to technology. So I think a lot of the opportunities as a researcher who's designing technology, machine learning, AI, is a lot of it is in the research, the experiment design. Somebody's asking, where's the info for the bias test in Ohio? Yeah, I can drop here in the chat. It's called the Project Implicit, and I can go ahead and drop.
And for everyone in the audience, please include questions in the chat. We'll try to address them throughout, but we'll definitely hold time at the end for anything that's on your minds. And Kevin, I think that's a great bridge to your work, because so much of the time you're dealing with maybe new technology and the layers of complexity within an enterprise process.
Yeah, so with what JD was saying in enterprise software, I think one of the big changes that's been happening is the evolution of the form, right? A lot of enterprise software is driven by a business process. So whether that's filing and labeling something so you can find it later, or it's documentation of things like that. The form is evolving. How can we surface data from one form that you've already filled out and pre-populate something else so you don't have to duplicate that work? Hence saving hours of employee time, hence reducing the sort of not particularly valuable work and taking some of the mindlessness out of work. And there's a lot of instances where different types of back-end technology is making that happen. But I think one of the big differentiators, I would say, is as design has spoken up a bit more in the human resources space, there's this whole new realm called human experience management, which is a reaction to the expectations of your employer changing as an employee. And that now employees are expecting their organizations to invest in their upskilling and invest in opportunities for them to move around the organization, to learn something new, or even to maybe discover a new career path you didn't even realize that was interesting for you before. And so personalization, like Azeez was talking about, is also finding its way into enterprise, right? So this technology is finding a life in a totally different space. And where I think as a designer, and for me, my role there, in enterprise software as a researcher, you have a very real role in describing or defining what this new business process is going to become, and the evolution of that. From at one point filling out a form to now you've already entered in the information you needed originally, and it's been learning from and capturing all these little tidbits that you've been doing as you're interacting with the system, and surfacing new opportunities for you that are very real, and that you now maybe have visibility into new roles that you never considered before. You found a strength as an employee that you didn't even realize you had before. And so that's the way that like creative technology is really finding its way, through Netflix, or through the cases that JD was talking about too, into enterprise software. And I think as a designer, there also comes that responsibility, as JD was talking about, you're not always designing for people who are tech savvy, and you're designing for vast different generations of people, and it's your work. You can't opt out of it always. So there's a whole nother relationship with this technology that you as a designer need to understand. What is someone really trying to do? And get out your own way to make that happen. So, there's a lot of folks that are really excited about, putting a chatbot in front of everybody, and chatbot can solve everything with enterprise software. If I just tell the system what I want, then somehow I'll get it, right? But sometimes you got to move out the way and say, is that really, am I bringing a chatbot in for chatbot's sake? Am I bringing AI in for the sake of AI? And starting to be a bit more critical about what is the real value proposition of this technology, and is that aligned with what the users are trying to accomplish? Oh, one other thing I want to touch on real quick that came up just in my mind is, I think as designers, we enter into spaces that are with humanists versus technologists. And I think oftentimes, we put the technologist on the engineer, and we put the humanist on the designer, and that's not always the case. I do think that we are the synthesizers of those two, and we need to be that. We need to understand what the technology is doing, but we also need to understand and advocate for human needs through research and through real conversations with real people. And I think if we get further removed from that, and in working for a corporate environment, sometimes it can feel very far removed from the real users that you're talking to, because sometimes there's politics with your customers. Sometimes there's all these other barriers that can get in the way of you really connecting with the people that your end users that you're trying to serve. So I think in organizations that are really trying to be more design-centric, be more user-centric, I think that's something to sort of diagnose in your organization. What are those barriers? And that's probably your roadmap to start working closer with your end users and getting, again, out of your own way of the sort of bias of your organization, how they operate, in the type of silos or just thresholds that they have with interacting with people outside your organization.
So I want to kind of pull on a couple of things that both Kevin and JD were saying about design, and also the craft of design, and how as a designer we should approach the responsibility of technology. So when we think about bias, and we also think about the responsibility of what it is that we create. Technology and technologists often want to say that technology is neutral, and maybe technology is neutral, but humans aren't. And so once a human picks up a piece of technology, that piece of technology then becomes the intent of that human being. And so when intent doesn't align with impact or outcome, it's the impact or outcome that you then have to deal with, not going back to the intent. And so how do you start to rectify the responsibility? Because our responsibility isn't to our intent. Our responsibility is to the outcomes. And so when we think about technology and how we're using technology in order to impact the world, to JD's point about biases, even that step further is that, do you have the people in the room who are going to be impacted by the things that you're creating? Because nobody is going to be able to understand all of the experiences in the world that are going to touch whatever it is that you're going to create. And so it's incredibly important for, one, be aware of your biases, but you can't even be aware of your biases if you don't have the people who are going to check you on them in the room to let you know that, hey, you're missing this point, you're missing this point of view, you're missing this perspective, and that's an important part of the craft. I think one of the ways that I actually even look at design is that design is a way for you to, it's a process of you gaining greater self-awareness to your positionality in the world, your positionality to all the other life forms and beings in the world. And so gaining that greater self-awareness also involves you entering a space with humility and understanding there's lots that I don't know about these different experiences. There's lots that I might not know about the impact that what it is that I intend to do will have. And my intention might be good, but I need to be prepared for the impact. And then whatever the impact is, I also need to solve for that in order to be able to take responsibility for what has been created.
I love everything you said, Azeez. It was super right on, right, kind of spot on. I think kind of piggybacking off what you said, I think what's really important, particularly when we're talking about machine learning and algorithms, I was reading this this great article by Sarah Paglacio in UX Matters a couple days ago, and she said something about historical databases used to develop algorithms are inherently themselves biased in their way that they position and think of gender or ethnicity. So in terms of having the right people in the room to check that bias, technology is not agnostic. It's not inherently just technology. It's built by humans who bring their own biases, who incorporate that in their decision-making. And how do we structure having the right people in the room to go, hey, wait a minute, that's messed up, that's wrong. So a huge part of the responsibility of those of us who are involved with and are compassionate and bring that empathy about those who end up using the software or designing it is being sure that we're the voice in the room that says, hey, doesn't that sound weird? Did we ask people? Or that seems off. And that is our accountability and responsibility as creative people.
Yeah, taking with what JD said about having the right people in the room and for the logic check, there's definitely barriers in an organization, like especially I think maybe the bigger you get, there can be more processes, more barriers in the way of that. And that's again, part of design is to say, well, this is what we need to be successful. This is part of what we as designers need in order to create a successful or valuable design. And that's part of the advocacy too, and the craft in an organization as part of being part of an organization that is investing in you and your craft, right? And what you do. And so it's not just advocating for the value of design, but it's also advocating for what you need, right? It's not just the value or the impact of design, but it's also what you need to design. And I think to that point, I think a conversation with somebody to check you on your bias is also part of research. And to me, research is everything up to it's all the learning up to when you place the first pixel. And then you can start to sort of iterate and get feedback and things like that. But it's informing your perspective. It's informing your values. And it's informing your intent, as Azeez was saying. It's informing all of these different types of decisions that you're going to make throughout the entire process of designing something. And so I think that is becoming, with scalability, and as more people are going to be utilizing what you're creating, JD's talking about designing for field workers from Los Angeles. Azeez is talking about designing, for Netflix and for a global audience. There's people coming at this from all different perspectives that you're never really going to experience yourself. So I think that's a growing part of the craft of design, is not just being great at placing pixels, but informing that intention, informing your perspective, informing your values. That's all part of design, the craft of design too. And I think there's so much more richness you're going to get from having your biases checked and having more diverse people in the room who have equity in the outcomes that you're delivering on.
The interesting thing is also about, I think it was JD or Kevin or both of you mentioning, older people who are using the technology. And I think one thing that for designers, for technologists, for engineers to recognize is that as much as you may believe this, you don't actually get to decide how somebody uses the thing that you create. Because once it gets out into the world, you no longer have that control. And so again, like as we're talking about impact, as we're talking about bringing people into the room, like the value of that is you starting to develop the knowledge that doesn't exist within you and your own identity of how other people are going to actually engage with this thing. There's so much of technology that's actually being used for people who are aging, but half the technology that's created is not created with them in mind. It's not created with their needs in mind. It's not created with their perspective. It's not created with their experiences in mind. In terms of like what their actual life is, what their actual day-to-day is. But oftentimes you would see people want to use technology to solve their problem, to solve the problem of somebody who's aging, without actually understanding the nuances of the way that they live. And it's important that those people, and it's interesting because design is actually an incredibly young field. You know, like when we look at design departments across organizations, you know, they're fairly, everyone's like, you know, millennial or younger, you know. But the things that we do create are going to impact a wider audience, you know, of people. And I think it's such an interesting case study when we start to look at the aging population, you know, like even now, like I grew up in a space where like I remember when there were no cell phones, there were no smartphones, you know? And so like, I'm in that area of transition, but we have people who have only ever known an iPad to exist, you know, only ever known those things to exist. And the ways that they perceive technology or perceive the tools that exist in the world are going to be very different. And then we have like people who are, you know, much older than me, who are still part of the community, still part of the world, and still engaging in this, and they're being left behind, but they're almost oftentimes the most at need of the things that we are creating.
Well, I think, Azeez, that brilliantly touches upon the need for a new look at participatory design, that participatory design or participation in the product of the business that you are a customer of isn't just something that happens in the R&D stage, isn't something that just happens over a session or a weekend or a sprint, but that there is a need for a continuous reflection and responsibility for that participation. And we see the consequences when those things go unchecked. We see technologies, creative and otherwise, that end up undermining the very principles on which they're built, because of that lack of transparency with the end user. And maybe JD, this is something that I think you've done incredible work in pushing the boundaries of what is expected of a design team, what's expected of research and design integrated together. Can you share with us some of those challenges and how you've overcome that in your practice?
Yeah, let me first take a minute to say, I love that Azeez said, you know, millennials in technology. And I'm like, I love that Azeez thinks I'm a millennial. Yeah, you know, one of the reasons I was really excited when I came to ServiceTitan, where I am now, is that they were looking for service design. They specifically had, you know, reached out for someone who was going to look holistically from the discovery research and across the organization. And so the small team I've built combines service design includes service design strategists who focus on the journey and the visualization of complex systems, service blueprints, ecosystems, and our service design researchers who look at workflows, but are also looking holistically, strategically. And I think I've basically always been able and been drawn to holistic research and understanding the humans wholly. I think anyone over time who's got an innately curious mind, they may start off doing more page level research, but over time, particularly if you're a curious person, one of those kids who ask questions, why, and your parents are like, shut that kid up. Most researchers are like that, and I'm no exception. So you will ask why, and over time, your research questions will end up going more macro than micro. So I've always been involved and most passionate about that research, and continuously piss people off. And I'm doing no less where I am now, asking questions, having a combination of people who are looking from macro to micro, looking at how all the dots connect across an organization. Of course, some of the challenges of that are, we work in oftentimes software is a very fast-paced environment. People worry about, time to market. I think there's always the trade-off and the struggle between can we spend the time, can we make it good enough and get it to market, or do we spend that extra time to fully understand the ecosystems, the complex interrelationships between even the internal employees who are, particularly with SaaS software, where you have things like onboarding and implementation and all of those people internally who play a huge part in making sure that the customer's experience, which is not just in the software, is satisfying. So I think there's a lot of trade-offs that are constantly happening between the customers, getting time to market and being sure that the customer is having a quality experience. So a lot of the work that we do as a team is definitely bringing in stakeholders from the very beginning. We have a lot of people who are subject matter experts who have been field or service workers themselves who are in the organization, which is wonderful. We bring them into the process, but we don't stop there. I think sometimes people use our subject matter experts whenever I've been in software, enterprise software, and they say, well, we can just ask the people internally to do that. And that's a start. It generally is just not enough in terms of once you've been in a company, you get biased. It's easy to get biased and people start forgetting that they're biased. So bringing in customers throughout the process, generally, before in the discovery stage, in a beta release, getting their feedback after, bringing in customer-facing people who are part of creating your assumptions. It's a huge part of being a researcher and a designer increasingly is the facilitation process, bringing people with different perspectives within the organization together, have them disagree without killing each other so that you can actually drive forward to meet the customer's needs. It's a huge part of the craft and the skills of designers. I know a lot of designers aren't comfortable with the facilitation process, the workshops and using Miro or Mural or whatever, but it's a huge part of the growing need to bring in the voice of the customer or the user throughout the process. Luckily, where I am, it is a big part of the mantra of the company. Making customers successful is a big, passionate part of the co-founders who themselves are sons of field workers. So it is a big part of the company mantra, but getting people to be authentic about not just saying it, but doing it is part of, even when it's inconvenient for time, is a part of the responsibility of the researcher and the designer, grow in an ongoing and growing way.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up when JD, you were talking about designers becoming more strategic and the facilitation aspect of that. I would say from my experience working in enterprise software, I think there is such a open opportunity there as a designer to make a greater impact in your organization. If you want to move up in your career and you've been designing screens for a while and you see all these different types of problems or discrepancies or just all these kinds of things like that, starting to question the why, and as you start questioning it more, you'll most likely find conflicts in business objectives or inconsistencies. Well, this is what the company does, but why am I doing this, right? And so your questions become more holistic in that way, as JD was saying too. And I think that there is a lot of pressure on designers to become more strategic. I think one of the really interesting areas is researchers becoming more strategic. And I want to unpack that really quick. A bit more. So I think facilitation, as JD was saying, is really important. I think, obviously thinking more holistically too, but one of the big things that I think is really important is clarity. And when you're working in enterprise space, there is so much complexity that you have to wrangle with, so many different objectives, and trying to make sense of that. And so all of these different tools as a designer, why are you going to, design something, get feedback on it, rechange it, and continuously, you may not actually be iterating. You may just be visualizing all of the different ideas in the room and not them actually coming together in a clear, coherent concept. And so it becomes even more important to take those steps back and to ask those whys and to really understand those whys, so that what you do create is actually what the organization needs and what your end users need, what your customers need. And so I think when we talk about that expectation of designers and researchers becoming more strategic, I think that's a lot of what that means to me, at least. And I think for researchers specifically, the type of research that you're doing is, a lot of research teams tend to be smaller than the design teams from my experience. And I think that really puts a lot of pressure on researchers to be moving away from that usability testing. And not to say that's not important, but as far as the impact you can make on an organization, the product, to start to move forward earlier and start to say, what is the business objective that we have here? And challenge the VP who came in and said, all right, well, I think we need to break into this space, but why? How does that align with our portfolio? How does that align with all the other things that we're doing? And I guarantee you, as a researcher who's asked those questions, your designers will appreciate you so much more for that and for that type of clarity. So when it does come to them putting that initial pixel down, there's so much more clarity. Such a big role for me as a researcher becoming more strategic was designers had this complaint that we're always getting these cryptic user stories. They don't tell me actually what to design. They don't tell me what I'm supposed to be creating. They don't tell me that a coherent problem to solve. And so as we started to sort of move earlier process and start to ask, well, we had this request come down. What does that mean? And why that? You start to realize that it's sort of a thought that was inflated and picked up, and there was not really that type of depth of thought and investigation that went into that. And I think that's really where these skills that we have as researchers can become incredibly impactful at getting to that level of detail that's necessary for a designer to actually design and to feed that process. So yeah, that's to me being more strategic.
I can add to that in terms of just so the impact that designers can make. And also one of the ways that I view design is like design does shape our lived experience in the world. So like all the things that we talk about, whether it's climate change, whether it is social justice, all of these different things, the artifacts that are creating some of these issues that we are navigating, they are created, they are designed artifacts. They're designed either intentionally or created by unintentionally designing. So they end up manifesting themselves and then facilitating the experiences that we do have. And so as a designer, making impact is actually also a choice. When you go into an organization, and it's like, do you want to be right? Do you want to make an impact? And the impact that a lot of designers can make too also is in influencing organizations to recognize the humanity, recognizing the needs of humanity, and making sure that the business goals are aligned to the people and the communities that are going to be impacted by the things that are created. And you have to be able to challenge the business whenever those things are misaligned, if you want to make the impact, right? And so like part of being strategic is one, like really understanding the business needs, understanding the organization's needs, understanding your end users' needs. And when those things don't align, as a designer, you have to be the one to raise the red flag and say, hey, something's not right here. We need to make some adjustments, and if you don't do that, because we were having this conversation before, and I would love to, JD, for you to jump in around having a seat at the table, right? It's like, one, the table is poorly designed. So also as a designer, you're being asked to, how do you redesign that table to make sure the right people are there in order to create the right outcomes, And so like, if you want a seat at the table, it's like, what are you going to do when you get there? What are you going to say when you get there? Are you actually even ready? And do you have the mindset, and are you prepared to actually speak to the things that you feel are misaligned or incorrect?
Yeah, I love that you said it. I know we've talked about a little bit about this, Azeez. I think one of the most interesting things I see, over the years, not just teaching, but with people, designers I've worked with, I would say it's so funny, and this is picked up during, COVID world, but probably every other month, I have a designer who I've worked with previously in my career who was probably pissed off at me at the time we were working together because I was trying to encourage them in my personal special way of trying to, be more strategic, have more critical thinking. Don't just sit around expecting your product manager or your researcher. You're bringing something. Do you want to sit at the table? Be ready to have a strategic conversation. Be ready to have your product manager or your VP have that conversation about trade-offs and pros and cons. It's something we've talked about where, different people who I've worked with, who I've worked with in the past are like, you used to really get on my nerves when I worked with you X years ago, but I learned so much from you. And oftentimes I had an email the other day from someone who was like, hey, do you remember can you send me that template? Because now and it makes me laugh oftentimes, because there is a point. I have a good friend who I've worked with at 3 separate companies who we were having lunch one time and he was talking about the research that he was doing. And I was like, wait a minute, when I worked with you, you wouldn't do any research. Why not? What are you doing research now for? And he was like, yeah, because you were there. I'm like, wait a minute. That's part of your skill. Like, what made you decide that you were going to have that conversation and be able to bring that data? And he was like, I didn't have any other choice. My own husband, who was an ArtCenter alum, who it took me years to convince him that research was part of the design process, really finally, kind of made that leap. He jumped the shark, so to speak, in terms of really embracing research when he realized it helped him get a seat at the table and be able to, not just be pissed off when the product manager gave him misdirection, but really be able to have those conversations and guide what he received. It's not, I'm getting bad user stories or I'm getting bad objectives. It's being able to have that dialogue with a product manager or a VP or a stakeholder or a co-founder and say, hey, not only is there something maybe off about this, but here's something questions, and here's a direction we might want to go instead. That's when people might pull out the chair for you and say, take a seat, because now you're having a conversation about not just the pixel, not just the form, but the function. And you get to be part of the decision-making process that drives that end result, and that, be able to be sure that you incorporate the user as well as the business and make the trade-offs. You've earned your seat at the table when you can have those kinds of discourses and dialogues.
So for the audience, we have 10 minutes left. We have more to cover, so we'll keep going, but please, anything that's on your minds or any questions you have personally related to this content or in the broad picture, please definitely let us know. One thing I guess that I'd like to maybe hear all of your thoughts on is how that evolution for you has gone in your careers. So oftentimes, and I don't want to misrepresent anything, but sometimes coming into design, I've been working with ArtCenter students for many, many years. I see that there's a desire to make something beautiful and a desire to solve a problem for a large number of people. And then as the evolution or kind of professional arc plays out, sometimes those underlying motivations really shift. So how have you all kind of navigated that in where you might have started or what might have brought you into this work with now where you are in this incredibly unique space. Maybe Azeez.
Sure, I can start. I guess like for me, like one of a core kind of thing is humility. So as I was saying prior about feeling like design is a process of unlocking greater awareness of your positionality to power, right? And so as I start to understand more and more about the people that are impacted by the things I create, I'm also understanding more and more about my position to power within an organization, right? I'm understanding the organization. I'm understanding, what are the pressure points and what are the leverage points for different parts of the organization, and how do I situate in that, and how can I influence those different things, and so it may sound counterintuitive sometimes, but at least for me, being curious all of the time about the perspectives and about the ways that things work, rather than saying, I have this idea or this thing that needs to get done and trying to push it through, right? It opens up so many doors for me to start to understand why what I have is not getting through. And it's not because it's not a good idea or this or that or the other, but what are all the mechanisms in place, whether it is political, whether it is technological, whether it is business oriented, whether it's about relationships, whatever it is, what are all the things that are in place that are creating the circumstances that don't allow progress to move forward in terms of what it is that I'm trying to do or trying to create, and then also, as both, JD and Kevin were mentioning about facilitation and stuff, it's like, you can't do things on your own, like in any endeavor, like you're going to need to build partnerships. You're going to need to bring people on board with what it is that you're trying to do. You need to find like minds, and you need to, the strength in numbers is actually going to help you get to where you want to be. But trying to fight everything by yourself is actually going to be incredibly difficult. And you all oftentimes are going to end up disgruntled. And obviously, it's like I had to go through some of those situations, myself, in order to like really, really learn, and really, really understand. You can't walk around and be like, everybody's just a freaking idiot. Like, like you have to but for me, like, like that core principle of like really approaching things with humility, and just saying like, I do have, a strong inclination towards what I believe is the right way to go, but I want to understand what everybody is thinking and how everybody is perceiving this. So I really understand how we can move forward and what are the bottlenecks of that happening.
I can pick up from that. So Azeez, I think, alluded a bit to processes in your organization. So you can, graduate from design school, or, get your first job as a designer, and really quickly find your place in these processes, and be a part of that machine. And for better or for worse, right? I think at some point you may start to realize that the quality of your design is also impacted by the quality of the process. And for me, I started my career at SAP really interested in systems and system design. And the way that manifested itself was really looking at processes. So it wasn't just the product, it was also what's our process. And in 2020, as a researcher, I became very aware of the limitations from just getting the funding we need to talk to external people outside of respondent.io, and actually talk to people in different parts of the world where our business is growing and we have no representation. we have predominantly in North America, Germany, a few folks in India, and even less in China. And that's a shame, because those are huge opportunities for the business to grow if we're actually designing for those, if we're actually considering the needs of those different cultures. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. You know, accessibility became a whole other aspect, as well as cultural differences. And so I think for me, I came in as a humanist, and I've never lost that, I think. But I did have to start to challenge a lot of the processes that I was participating in, and asking, well, I understand this process, and I feel that I know where we can start to engage with people who are not represented at the table right now. Like, I've been through this process enough times, I understand where those opportunities can be. So then that became the conversation with the VP. How do we make this happen? What budgets can you make available? You know, what resources are out there? And so I think I think if you're not delivering on the quality that you want in your design, also question the process. And the process can change, because literally you can change the way that you're doing the process. And so there is agency in there. And I think that's not something to forget. And one other thing I want to add about that too, is that for me, I think in terms of medium fidelity. And to sort of qualify that, I think there's business strategy that tends to be this very ambiguous business objective. And especially if you work in a corporate setting that's so high level and you didn't have a seat at that table most of the time. So it comes down, it's cascaded down, it's super ambiguous. And hopefully your manager is able to, you know, decode it, because it tends to be quite cryptic. That's a super high level, low fidelity type of thinking. And then you have the very pixel level, right? It's very high fidelity, but doesn't always have that same level of visibility. And when I think about the medium fidelity, it's this in between. It's the service, the experience that we're delivering, and it's what people actually experience. People will interact with, you know, a screen. People will interact with a product, but the experience, what they're perceiving, their perceptions, their goals, their objectives, how satisfied they are with your service. In my mind, that's all medium fidelity, and all of that is a huge part of this business strategy actually being executed on through the sort of pixel level deliverable. And so to start working as a designer in that medium fidelity, you're impacting so much, and you're tying everything together, and you are executing on that craft, in my mind, of delivering on the business objective, delivering on the expectations of your user, and delivering on beautiful design. And I think that to me is this really rich space to be working in that I found really fulfilling.
Got nothing left to say. The guy said it all.
Well, maybe JD, since we don't have any questions, maybe you could, in wrapping this up, and of course Kevin and Azeez to weigh in as well. But what, not advice, but beyond what you've mentioned, is there anything else that you think our community today should be thinking about or looking at? Or it could be another practical tool, or some other speaker, or somebody else that is inspiring you, or a methodology that you're starting to become familiar with. And maybe that's a great way to wrap up, is each of your recommendations on like an inspirational, educational, or you know, provocative thing that is entering into your space.
Well, in the area of you know, being sure that if you are in the position to inform or design these algorithms using AI and machine learning, there's you know, the great work of Dr. Timnit Gebru, who's the co-founder of Black in AI, formerly at Google, and then Joy Buolamwini at MIT Labs Civic Media Group. So there's definitely opportunities to leverage some of the good work of those incredible women. I think one of the things that is always so important about this profession, I feel incredibly humbled and lucky to work in this profession. I've worked incredibly hard to be allowed even in the door, but I simultaneously felt incredibly humbled and lucky to be able to have a positive impact on people's lives and make technology accessible to everybody. So with that, I really take that responsibility very seriously. I take it, I'm almost offended when people in my profession take it very kind of peripherally or casually. It really is so important, the fact that we have the opportunity to impact people's lives in a positive way. People who maybe don't have access to internet, if you're using your phone to run your business, or being able to find ways to work at a warehouse to feed your family, and level up your skills using that kind of technology. So being sure that you approach this profession with the humbleness that you have the impact on people's lives, and your responsibility is to be a forever learner about them, about your profession, about your responsibility to positively impact people in a way that is respectful and ethical and thoughtful. I think that's the most important advice I can provide.
Thank you. That is brilliant.
So there's this great book by an architect, John Kerry, and he says design dignifies. And I think that concept is something that's completely aligned with my values. One of my core personal values is to carry yourself with dignity and treat others with respect. And that's a value I live by outside of design as well as in design, but it really stems from more of my my lived experience in society and all that. So I think with that, Azeez has this great quote that he says, and I think it makes this very tangible, is that everyone has a right to a well-designed life. And I think that's part of dignity as well. Dignity is not the designer bringing somebody, giving somebody who you're assuming has an dignity on a silver platter. I don't think that's what we're talking about. But I think design in its design, or good design, in my opinion, is design that does dignify, that respects and seeks to align the value that you're offering with what your users or what your the people that you're designing for need, and it fits them well, and it fits their life well, and it makes their life better. And I think that's what that means to me.
I guess I can add something fairly quickly, and I do see there's one question in the chat, but I'll take your question first, Robbie. So as I kind of progress in my career, actually, the things that influence my design practice are less and less design books or other designers or other design things. I'm constantly more engaged in other cultures, the experiences and identities of other people, and the way that the natural environment and the world kind of works, And so those are the things that the relationships between people, the relationships between things, the relationships between environments and cultures, over time, African cultures, Asian cultures, indigenous cultures who've developed practices in order to articulate their existence within the world that they exist in. Those are the things that really inform the way that I see the world, because we are kind of socialized within a particular system and a way of believing or thinking about the world. And if we stay in that realm, then we are locking ourselves out of so much wisdom that exists between the cultures and people who existed before us, who've thought about things in different ways, and other cultures that also just think about things different ways because the way that language is actually structured. And so if there's anything that I'd want to leave people with, is to really be exploratory of other cultures and other identities, and lead with an open mind to see how they perceive things that way, and how that might expand your own perspective of your own existence in the world and what you end up creating because of that.
That's beautiful. And I think a great note to conclude, and Beata has a question, and I wonder if, well, if you have time to address the question, I would love that. But if we want to wrap up, maybe Beata could get in touch and reach out to you individually. Let me know. Do you have time for just talk about this one? It's a tricky question and requires real attention. So
yeah, I'll just maybe quickly say, if in the I'm trying to understand the question. In the organization, you're encountering biases toward mental health care patients that you're supposed to be researching. So, wow, that's, yeah. Again, the opportunity to try to bring people together who've already structured or requested the research to begin with. I don't know if the organization that asked for the research is outside or you're coming into the organization, but it really is one of those opportunities to bring those disparate people together and potentially start your standard process of what is the problem we're trying to solve, who are the people we're trying to solve it for, which people are we supposed to be bringing in, why are we not bringing in certain people, why are we leaving out certain people? It's those questions that's kind of set that your experience and your expertise as a designer in terms of facilitating and creating that alignment is crucial, particularly when you're talking about a group of people that the organization is intentionally deciding to leave out. So it's your standard process of aligning your stakeholders, and it doesn't mean that they're going to then accept the answer, but it at least opens up the conversation of why not.
Yeah, and I could add too, so like if I'm understanding the question right, there's bias towards mental health patients from your organization, and if I'm getting that right, or just bias towards mental health patients in general in the process or thing that you're kind of creating. And I do think that it's also important to name and be explicit about the impact of that bias. Like what impact does that bias have? And make sure that that's actually clear to everybody who is involved in the project. And what impact does it have not only to the organization, not only to the patients, but to the organizations and to all the stakeholders who are involved, right? And so like, I think like that's maybe one of the first things that I could even start with, because you have there is an assumption too of what that impact is going to be. And if you actually don't even know what the impact is, you can even start there saying like, what is the impact of our biases to these patients? And that can then like provide a pathway forward of how to kind of start to move forward and how do you actually start to approach things. So I don't know if that I'm like, hopefully that helps and that like gets at the question. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add to that. I would have said the same, yeah, but probably not as eloquent.
Well, I so appreciate you all staying a little extra longer, and to everybody who's joined us for the last 10 minutes, appreciate you as well. And this wraps up our conversation today. Critical Discourse in Design is ongoing, and Creative Tech Week concludes tomorrow with 3 programs starting at 11 a.m. in Capture This and the Future of Graphic Design and Technology, and taking us through a wide range of future explorations. So we hope you can attend tomorrow. And Kevin, Azeez, JD, thank you so much. You're incredible in all that you do and what you bring to ArtCenter, our community, our wide world. And this is just the beginning. So eager to see where it all goes.
Thank you guys. Always good to see you, Kevin, Robbie, Azeez.
Thank you.
Here, take care, everyone.
All right. Yeah.